Aloha mai kākou. Mahalo nui for welcoming us into your day. I'm Lyz Soto, and this is Mana Wai, because the many sources of water make the land live, a podcast of Hawaiʻi Council for the Humanities. Poetry has long been an intimately woven strand of Hawaii. For the moments that stay with us, many turn to poetry, to stories, to music, to remember, to connect, to better understand. Poet, mom, and teacher Brandy Nālani McDougall was recently selected as our newest Hawaiʻi State Poet Laureate. I got the chance to visit with Brandy in her home. It was a holiday, so you can sometimes hear her daughters checking in on us. We shared food and talked story about the ways poetry has saved her life and how maybe, just maybe, poetry can save the world. Mahalo, Brandy. One of the questions that I really want to ask is how would you describe the moment where you discovered poetry or the moment that poetry discovered you?
Yeah. Okay. So probably my first connection with poetry in some way was through my dad. My dad was a musician, and my earliest memories of him were of him kind of composing music, trying to write out songs, and playing them on his guitar. He was the composer and the lyricist of the song My Island Maui, which is often taught for people learning ukulele and things like that. So I love to, kind of hear that around when people are kind of sharing music in some way. And then I think there's been a few bands since then who've actually covered it as well. So it's really beautiful to kind of hear his music out in the world. Yeah, so my first connection to poetry was really through music and through seeing that people did that. People made songs. People thought about the world around them and tried to put them together in some kind of beautiful way. And I was really moved by that as a young person. And so I'd also kind of go around making up songs, and eventually it became making up stories. And later I discovered this thing called poetry through high school writing assignments. And that's what really clicked with me, that poetry. Yeah. Part of it is I wasn't particularly talented in terms of any musical instruments. So I think that played also a role where I was like, okay, poetry could still work for me, even if I can't, play the piano or play the guitar or anything like that. I could still use my voice. I could still use the page.
It would be remiss for me not to mention that you have recently been selected as the next Hawaiʻi State Poet Laureate. Congratulations.
Thank you. Mahalo.
Part of your tenure as a Poet Laureate, what you would really like to do is one of the themes would be about healing and poetry. And I know from, past conversations and also how, in a lot of ways, one of the reasons why you're coming to it from this angle of healing is because poetry has healed you. And I think I've even heard you say how poetry saved your life. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I'm not exaggerating at all to say that I think poetry saved my life. There are ways in which when, we face trauma, when we endure trauma in some way, we might keep it really bottled up. What really helped me with regard to poetry was it gave me something to create out of it. It gave me not just an outlet to kind of release what had been kind of bottled up inside me, but a space to hold it like outside of me, if that makes sense. So, and the idea that even, I guess, that something could be created that's even beautiful from it. It just made me feel so empowered. So, yeah, I've experienced a lot of loss. So my dad died in a car accident when I was in 7th grade. It was really difficult to talk about because my parents were divorced at the time, and my mom was in a new relationship, and her partner at that time felt really threatened by my grief, my sisters and my grief. And so there were ways in which we were kind of silenced by it. And then just a lot of other, other traumas that happened kind of since then, some of which involved family, others of which involved predators that had come into my life. For example, one was a doctor who I had to see. I had struggled for a long time as a child with really chronic asthma, for which I had to be hospitalized a couple of times. A lot of my childhood memories are just being really, really sick, and having to be in bed. And I had to see an asthma specialist, and he was able to get me in a room by myself once, and sexually assaulted me as a child. And so kind of working through issues like that, where I felt, or I didn't always feel like I could share. And that particular event with the doctor, I wasn't able to even come to grips with it and tell anybody else about it until I was in my 20s, and poetry played a big role in being able to kind of work through that and let me know, like, it's okay. And it gave me a space to work through all of those emotions of shame, which of course shouldn't be on me, but was still a part of what I felt, of anger and rage, of not being able to share this, and of what had happened to me, and also of, like, I guess just being able to release it, because if you keep it inside, there's ways in which it really becomes self-destructive for you in different ways, and that manifests in, toxic relationships and friendships, and putting yourself in precarious positions and things like that. And I knew it wasn't good for me to keep it in, but at the same time I didn't have an outlet until poetry to be able to let it out and to be able to create something from it. So poetry really gave me that.
Thank you, Brandy. I appreciate you sharing so much of yourself. And I think one of the things that came up, it was that potential private versus public pull that exists in poetry. Unlike journaling, where a lot of times people will use journaling as an outlet, right, to express something and to kind of get it outside of themselves. But there's something about poetry that a lot of times there is this public expectation where you're going to be sharing it with people. That's part of the design. And how I think a lot of poets, especially who, wrestle with difficult things and share them with people, that a lot of times it'll be about this testimony.
Right.
And how do you feel like that component works into, your concepts of healing and concepts of poetry?
Yeah, mahalo for asking that really thoughtful question. I think poetry is really about connection, It's about trying to find the words in order to connect with something else outside of you, whether or not that other being is human or not. Because I also believe you can want to connect with Aina and just read your poems out loud to Aina and still kind of feel a sense of connection that way too. But yeah, there is something about not just releasing it, sharing it with somebody else or something else, and being able to feel a response. Before the poem is written, maybe you have like this raw feeling, right? This raw emotion or raw material or a raw kind of story that's been like eating away at you or somehow in you and that you need to get out. And so for me, sometimes that could be something somebody said to me, and it keeps coming back like years later, right? Or it keeps haunting me in some way. Or maybe it's an image that I need to get out. So I know now when that happens, rather than trying to push it away, that I need to pay attention to it. And so I write it down. And then later, there's a way in which maybe it could find its way into a poem, or I think about writing a poem even as I'm writing it down. And in that way, something kind of magical happens in that process. Crafting that poem, working through it, it becomes transformed, and it feels as though I've transformed it. And then share it with somebody else who can then feel it, and then can, even reflect on it, and maybe even it would lead to a poem of their own, or it would lead to something else of their own, or even a conversation we have. There's something like that adds a whole other element to it that has made it so much more healing than perhaps even just kind of writing the poem itself could do. There's something about being able to share it, being able to get it out, giving it voice. I'm from people who believe, that there's so much power in our voice, right? That when we speak things out, like, that's part of how that mana gets released into the world, right? And being able to share that with somebody or something, and have it reflected back to you in some way, it just shows that you've done the right thing, or it feels like you've done the right thing. Like, that's what makes the whole cycle, I think, complete, is that connection.
I'm glad you brought up that coming from a people where voice is such a powerful, like, the mana is there and acknowledged and accepted. Because also thinking about the literary tradition, and I am using the word literary deliberately, tradition that you belong to, that is part of the oral traditions of Kanaka Maoli. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see yourself in that genealogy.
Wow. I think, I am primarily a page poet, or what is called a page poet, which means we tend to kind of cling to the page in certain ways.
So how would you think of the written word within that tradition? And even thinking about, like, some of the writers who, you've drawn inspiration from. Like, I know that you've talked in the past a lot about Hanani K. Trask and the power of, particularly of her poetry, but also of her essay writing. But, in a number of these instances, right, it's actually the written word that's delivered this huge moment of power in Kanaka Maoli traditions.
Yeah, mahalo. For me, interestingly enough, I feel like I'm able to be stronger with my voice on the page than I am in person. So in person, I'm kind of like maybe a little bit more on the quiet side. I am not necessarily, I'm not like Kaunani K with her fist up in the air, but I feel like my writing tries to do that at the same time, but I think my being in person is a little different, and it's interesting to kind of feel those two sides of me. But I would say my written work is really in line with a lot of my really amazing kumu, like Garrett Hongo, who was my first poetry teacher, I feel, who really, really challenged me to write down everything. He was the first kumu to really say, like, whatever you're running away from, that's what you need to write about. Wow. And damn, that was hard to do. And, because he was demanding, blood, sweat, and tears, basically, by doing that. And, but that's, I'm really thankful I listened to his teachings, because you have to be brave like that. And that's the work that's required of you to heal, right? To really heal and become the person that you're supposed to be. So with Haunani and her work, which is very lyrical and very ku'e, I discovered this really, like, this amazing beauty and voice that also is really rooted in our akua and our aina that I really loved and wanted to do. And so she inspired me in that way. And then Albert Wendt, who's been just an amazing kumu for so many throughout the Pacific, he was so accepting and encouraging of any kind of creative expression. So yeah, I've been really blessed to have all of these just really amazing teachers in my life.
So one of the things that I know that you've talked about having had some experiences where you had to really push to be allowed to tell like Kanaka Maoli stories, in spaces where that was like, oh, well, that's not interesting, or, Yeah. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and two, also just thinking about ways that we can push back against those experiences.
Yeah. Mahalo for that. I think it's really interesting. Without calling out anyone in particular, there's been a few just kind of just awkward, uncomfortable conversations when I was a graduate student in the English department at UH that came up. There were also some that happened, prior to that when I was doing my master's in Oregon. I mean, really, if I reflect back enough, like they're there throughout my whole life, unfortunately, these different moments. They were most disturbing to have when I was at Kamehameha as a high school student. I think most folks who've graduated from Kamehameha now, their experience would be really different, thankfully, hopefully, and thankfully. But when I was in school there in the 90s, the focus was on college prep, and in particular, college prep for a mainland college, which had a particular kind of meaning in terms of, so what it meant was in English, for the most part, there was no Hawaiian literature taught at all. There was a Hawaiian literature class, but it wasn't a part of, I guess, the honors cycle. And so if you were in honors English at Kamehameha at the time I was going there, you read absolutely no Hawaiian literature, no Pacific literature. In fact, there wasn't even people of color literature. It was pretty much just white men and a few white women that you read their literature, right? And there was this strong belief that that's what you needed to know. And so I was really hungry for anything that could kind of speak to my own experience, because I loved stories. And I had read a book of Hawaiian legends, Hawaiian mo'olelo, with my grandfather growing up. And those are things that I gravitated toward always, and at Kamehameha it just felt like they were absent. Even though later I discovered that there was a Hawaiian literature class being offered at the time by Richard Hamasaki that somehow I just didn't know about, or I didn't register because I was on that honors track. But so I have this really clear memory of kind of a showdown between myself and Ms. Powers, who taught AP English my senior year. She was this little old haole lady who was so intimidating. Like, she was even kind of like bent over and hunched, like she was so old, but she had this way of just like staring you down like you were like 2 feet tall, like even though you towered over her. So Ms. Powers, which is also a really apt name for her, Ms. Powers. Ms. Powers had us go and find a poem, and we could choose a poem by anyone. And so I found Langston Hughes in the library, and I was like, oh my gosh, Langston Hughes, where have you been all my life? And I found this poem that he had written called, gosh, and I think it was just called Colors, or Color. And the poem was about like wear your color like a flag. And it was all about like being proud of the skin you're born in, and how others might try to make you feel ashamed for it. And it really spoke to me, and it made me think about the ways in which, so even though I was in high school, I was raised really close with my grandparents, because my parents were pretty young when they had me, where my grandparents had told me things about how they were made to feel ashamed of who they are. And that just really, it really, stung me. And there were times even, in my young life where I had felt like I was ashamed to be who I was too as a Hawaiian, or places I would go where I felt like, wow, I feel really brown now, and then there's still times when I feel like that. And so that poem really spoke out to me, and I shared it in the class. I read it out, and then I started to say, I chose this poem because I feel it's a lot like what we went through as Hawaiians, or what we go through sometimes too. And Ms. Powers cut me off and said, "How dare you?" And I was really kind of confused. First of all, I hadn't even finished what I was going to say, but she just seemed so angry. And then she finished, like, "How dare you compare your experience as a Hawaiian to what Black people have gone through?" And I was still a little confused, So I actually said to her, "Can I finish what I was going to say?" And she says, "Not if you're going to continue what you're saying."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, I am going to continue." And so I said, while our experience is not the same historically, I feel like I can resonate with what Hughes is saying here, in being made to feel ashamed for the color of his skin and who he is. I said, our grandparents were made to feel ashamed of who they are as Hawaiians. I'm like, and there's times when I still feel that way too. And my classmates were, nodding their heads and everything, but whoa, Miss Powers was so pissed at me. And I thought she was going to like pop a blood vessel in her eyes or something. Like, she was staring me down like so crazy. And she turned really bright red and she says, "I don't want to hear any more from you." And then she went off on a tirade about how dare I compare, there in no way, shape, or form does the Hawaiian experience, because as a haole woman, she of course knows all about our experience as Hawaiians. In no way, shape, or form does the Hawaiian experience compare to being enslaved. And how dare I even feel as though I could empathize with what Langston Hughes is talking about. And it just felt so wrong to me that she was doing that. And at the same time, she obviously felt so strongly about it, and she had the power in that situation. So, yeah. And, I kept reading Langston Hughes because I really felt like he was my kind of gateway into a whole new world of poetry that I had been kept from, I felt like, and it led me to other just amazing, Black creators at that time, which also then led me to Black theorists, and then led me to Indigenous poets and Indigenous theorists. It's so interesting that it had to kind of take that roundabout way. But that's definitely a memory that kind of stood out to me. And I wrote a poem about it because there had been other struggles with Ms. Powers after that, of course, because then at that point, I was labeled a troublemaker, and so everything I wrote was somewhat suspicious or suspect, and I think that was on purpose. I also tried to make things. I also tried to rebel in different ways, and it's a poem called Tiny Rebellions in my first book, The Salt Wind, Kamakani Pa'akai.
I'm wondering if you can describe a moment where maybe say like that you've encountered either like a reader or an audience member who's come up and told you, about what your poetry meant to them because of what it said that maybe they weren't able to say for themselves.
So I have a poem that I wrote from Kamakani Pa'akai, The Salt Wind. It's called Ma'alaia Harbor Father's Day, and it's a really short, very imagistic poem about my sister and I going to Ma'alaia Harbor, which is where our father's ashes were scattered. He had worked there as a captain of a tour boat that would take people out to, I guess, just sort of watch the humpback whales and stuff. and he would play his music and he just loved Ma'alaia. I think it was really healing for himself too. And so we scattered his ashes out in Ma'alaia. And since then, my sister and I would go there and we'd throw flowers out onto the water, for him, like on Father's Day and for his birthday and Christmas. And, anytime like we would be able to kind of get together and remember him. And I still do that every now and then from Oahu, so I feel like, okay, if I'm just near an ocean, it'll still get to him. So I shared that poem, and it's about the image of the flowers kind of floating out away from us. And I've had a few people kind of over the years come up to me and say, like, mahalo for that poem, that they've lost like their father, or they've lost someone close to them, and that the image of the flowers kind of taken away by the wind and the water, as if they're going to him, really, kind of helps them think about like what it means now for that person who you've lost. Like, they're in a different form, but there's ways in which your love for them still gets to them, right? And that was just amazing to me. I'm kind of crying now thinking about it, that I was able to connect with people in that way. There's moments like that where you feel like, wow, I was able to really kind of connect with this person because of that. And we share that with each other. And there's a kind of like knowing or understanding between you. And it came from me taking that first step to try to put that grief into words.
So I get to ask a more victorious question now. How can poetry save the world?
Yes. So, yes, poetry can save the world because there's a way in which it can be really freeing. I think we're at a space now, of course, where, freedom of speech has its own sort of like pitfalls and complexities and contentiousness. But poetry is not necessarily freedom of speech, even if it's like freedom of expression. It's not like speech that's free is going to save us, but it's like speech that's free but also thoughtful and careful and thinking about what its ramifications would be in the world. I think that's what would save the world.
So kind of maybe a thoughtful speech.
Yeah. I think a lot of what's out there with people with free speech, a lot of what's said is harmful. And I think with poetry, you're asked to, or you're required to think about what the ramifications are of that power, right? And that if that's your intention, then that's your intention, and you face the consequences for it, right? But you have to take a minute to really think about if that's your intention. It's not just saying whatever comes to mind out of anger or sadness or whatever.
You've talked about your father quite a bit as we've talked, and you also brought up a poem that you said a lot of people had been impacted by, the Ma'alaia Harbor, and it would be really wonderful if you could share that with us.
Sure. Mahalo. This is Ma'alaia Harbor Father's Day. My sister and I sit on rocks, watching sails and glass-bottom boats, but you are nowhere, so we wait. Waves glide slowly toward us, crash, then run away, carrying the unstrung lei we made for you this morning, little white buds of plumeria, gardenia. We will stare until they fade, when we remember more of you and the sea you loved, what you carried in your pockets. Cloudy shells, hazy beach glass. On our visits every other weekend, you led us to the beach, retrieved pebbles, pieces of driftwood, lifeless angelfish, frail as ashed paper, whatever the water had enough of, spit out. Once a whole bottle, salt-etched green, unbroken, let sunlight spark a fire in your hands. Over our young heads, a faint flash, today's sun, falling fast into the waves, your lei still floating toward a horizon pierced with the night's first stars.
Mahalo, Brandy. Mahalo Piha for joining us. You've been listening to a conversation with Brandy Nālani McDougall. I want to thank Brandy for sharing so much with us, including the music for this episode, which is My Island Maui, written, composed, and performed by her father, Jeffrey McDougall. I can't say enough about how fortunate we are to have Brandy as our Hawaiʻi State Poet Laureate. She'll be doing workshops, readings, and performances, helping us all explore the ways connecting with poetry and Aina can help us heal and imagine a better future. Visit us at highhumanities.org to find out more about Brandy and about workshops and events for the Poet Laureate program. In our next episode, Brandy talks about the power of the kumulipo, the vibrancy of Hawaii's literary community, and as a bonus, she reads from her upcoming book, Aina Hanau, Birthland. This is Na Mana Wai, because the many sources of water make the land live, and I'm Lyz Soto with the Hawaii Council for the Humanities. A hui ho.